Hello and welcome to the Haaretz podcast. I'm Allison Kaplan-Summer. Israelis are watching closely as the United States and Iran exchange fire. Finger on the trigger as spectators, although heavily supporting the needs of the U.S. military here. So far, bases have been attacked across the Gulf and in the neighboring country of Jordan, but there has been no direct military involvement in Israel. As of this recording, everything can change. In the meantime, President Donald Trump's extended involvement in the Middle East continues to roil U.S. politics as the U.S. midterm elections approach, with Israel as one of the central focuses of debate and disagreement in Washington and beyond. I can't think of a better guest to come on the podcast and discuss and try to make some sense of it all than Haaretz's own Amir Tibon. Amir, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Alison. It's good to be here again.
You come to us wearing many hats. You are our former Washington, D.C. correspondent, our former diplomatic correspondent, former host of this very podcast, and currently you are the opinions editor of Haaretz, and many listeners know you as the author of the best-selling book, The Gates of Gaza, which recounts your family's harrowing experience on Kibbutz Nahal Oz on October 7th, and the rescue mission by your father, Noam Tibon, who, it should be noted, has now entered politics. He's running in the upcoming elections with the Yesh Atid party. As opinions editor, you are curating opinions and presumably have some of your own, right?
There are so many things right now to talk about and write about, Alison, and I get pitches every day from people with a range of anti-Semitism, Jewish future, Israel and Turkey, Israel and Armenia, Israel and Australia. It's endless, and I'm enjoying the opportunity to read so much and think a lot. I like that part of the job.
Oh, we're enjoying reading what you have to offer in the opinion section. From your perch and from your experience, what do you make of the rapid-fire transformation of public opinion and political positions of leaders in the United States on Israel? You know, they say that things happen very slowly and then suddenly all at once, and that really feels like what's gone on here. There's obviously both sides of the aisle to discuss. You can give your comments just on general public opinion, but for now, let's start with the political focus, and we'll start with the Democratic Party, since my last two guests on the podcast were Representative Ro Khanna, who had a very well-publicized encounter in the West Bank and has been leading the charge to end military aid to Israel, and newly nominated, but it looks like practically elected.
Soon to be congressman, yeah.
Soon to be Congressman Brad Lander, who, had he been congressman, would have definitely participated in that vote on ending military aid, which failed. It was co-sponsored by Thomas Massie and the Republican Party and Ro Khanna on the Democratic side. While the measure failed, 103 Democratic congressmen voted to end military aid to Israel. So again, you have that perspective of having spent previous years in Washington and watching it from now. Why the change? Why so fast?
I agree with you that this has been building up for years, but the last 2 years we've seen a very sharp and sudden deterioration. And I don't think it's much of a mystery. I think we have the most far-right government in the history of Israel. And then we have in the United States a Democratic Party that is moving to the left. And that just puts the two sides on an instant collision course. I don't think there's any denying that the politics on both sides are driving this. You add to that 3 years of war. And I want to remind the listeners that David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, when he put down a national security strategy for Israel, one of the issues that he emphasized was that Israel needed short and decisive wars, because he understood the risk of prolonged wars and what that would do to Israel in terms of its international standing and its place in world public opinion and the ability of our allies to remain supportive. And this government chose a different path, a long and indecisive war. And now we're seeing the results. And we're seeing that, putting aside for a minute, what's happening in Washington, D.C., the bigger problem is what's happening in American public opinion, because the politicians, to some degree, they impact public opinion, for sure. but they also respond to it. And what they're responding to right now, whether it's Democrats who vote to end military aid to Israel, or Republicans who still support aid to Israel but are adopting much more critical language against the country, what both of them see is public opinion polls showing again and again that approximately 60% of Americans have a negative view of Israel. And the younger you go, the worse it gets. Among younger Americans, I think we're close to 80%. That's the real problem. And that's what's mostly driving this very, very sharp turn against Israel in American politics.
How does the deterioration on the Republican side differ from what's gone on the Democratic side?
With both Republicans and Democrats, first of all, the age factor is a critical factor. Because among younger Republicans, the numbers are almost as bad as they are among Democrats in general. And that's a rather new trend. And I think what is driving it is perhaps different than what's happening on the Democratic side, where you actually go back to the Obama years and to the sense that Netanyahu was disrespectful toward President Obama, and then his alliance politically with Trump. All of that has really impacted what's happening on the Democratic side. With the Republicans, there are other issues at hand here. First of all, there is an isolationist wing within the Republican Party that is ascendant. J.D. Vance, Tucker Carlson. And that's a problem for Israel, regardless of Israeli policy specifics. This strain of the isolationist, historically anti-Semitic American right is something that we've seen before, and now it's making a comeback. But there are also issues where Israeli mistakes are having an impact. One example is the question of Christians in the Holy Land, Palestinian Christians living in Israel, the churches in Jerusalem, the churches in Gaza. These are stories that have made a lot of headlines in America in the last 2 or 3 years. And when you have this ongoing combination of, a church being hit in Gaza and a Palestinian village in the West Bank attacked by violent settlers, and viral videos of ultra-Orthodox religious Jews spitting on nuns in Jerusalem, you combine all of that together and suddenly a segment of American population that you would actually expect to see, very supportive of Israel because of how Christian communities at large are supporting Israel, is turning against us. And a half-functioning, not even a fully functioning, but a half-functioning Israeli government would have caught this problem on time and said, okay, we're losing support among young Christians, including even young evangelicals. Some of these issues are beyond our control. But here is what we can do, and would have taken action to change that. Instead, we have a government right now that is only helping this trend.
Well, the Wall Street Journal just picked up on reporting that we've been doing at haaretz, basically our colleague
Omer Ben Jacob. Incredible reporting on this.
On the millions, multi-millions that Israel has been and is now pouring into trying to influence public opinion, especially among the young, online, and the Wall Street Journal picked it up from the American side, looking at the public relations firms that Israel is hiring. Is there a point to it? I mean, when we talk about mistakes, are these mistakes that can be corrected through flooding AI and the internet and social media with positive messaging about Israel?
I'm skeptical. And I think if you take a kind of zoom out and a broader look at this and you examine how much money has been spent over the last decade, even decade and a half, on hasbara, as we call it here, on curating Israel's image to American eyes and also in other countries, we would probably be talking about billions of dollars, Ellison, whether it's Israeli governmental money or donations from American Jews and other supporters of Israel. And what are the results we can show for it? For all that money that's been spent over so many years, the results are 60% of Americans and closer to 80% among younger Americans have a negative view of Israel. So this idea is not working. And what is required, first of all, is a deeper conversation here in Israel about the values of our country and society, about the way we present ourselves, not only to the world, but to ourselves, first of all. Who are we? And what is Israel's mission, I would say, as a country today? Where do we want to be as a society, as a country, a decade from now? And once we have that conversation and we understand our own values, then I think we will be able to better present that to the world as well. But pouring another $1 billion without changing the realities here on the ground, I don't think it's going to do much. Now, that doesn't mean Israel necessarily has to now adopt the election plank of Meretz or, whatever is left of the old Zionist left. That's not where I'm taking this. But still, we cannot expect to basically hit the wall under this extremist far-right government and then pour $1 billion over it, and everyone will think that what we're actually hitting is a wall of flowers and trees. There's a reality here that we have to come to terms with. I also want to say that the problem for Israel in America is not the far left and the far right. Because the far left and the far right, they will probably continue to hate us no matter what we do, what we say, and what we change. The problem is that we have gone from a situation where the fringes of American society, the far left and the far right, have a very negative view of Israel, to a reality where 60% of Americans have such a view. And that's what we should be asking ourselves. Not why does Tucker Carlson not like us? Not why does Zoran Mamdani not like us? And I appreciate the fact that both of them are ascendant and that there is a problem in American society, that both the right and the left are to some degree becoming more extreme, and that's not in our control. Yeah. But our problem is the 60% and growing number, and that reaches deep into the American mainstream. So it's very tempting to say, and I've heard this from some friends in the Jewish community in the US, well, there's nothing we can do. No matter what we do, people like Tucker Carlson will never like us. Well, okay, but not everybody shares Tucker Carlson's vision for America, and yet 60% don't like us. So something has to change.
Israelis seem very focused on Carlson and, as you said, on the vice presidents, on J.D. Vance, whereas, Tucker Carlson can talk and talk, but Vance has had real influence on American policy and American decision-making.
But not so much, I would argue, by the way. I think he's not a very influential vice president in terms of policy. I think actually his biggest influence is in the talking sphere, in how he's shaping the debate and the, kind of influencing the terms, the terminology around Israel and Jews in America. I think that's his real danger from our point of view.
Not that he's pushing the diplomatic solution for Iran and, again, was supposedly pushing hard for the short-lived memorandum of understanding, which was supposed to prevent the Iran escalation. And Trump even joked, right, if this goes badly, I'm going to blame it on J.D. Vance. But you don't think that's significant?
I think it's just too early to tell. We're seeing inside the administration a power struggle between J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio over how to continue from this point we've reached with Iran and Lebanon and Israel. It's a quagmire, it's a problem for the administration, and Vance has offered one possible solution and Rubio another, and now it's playing out between them, and eventually it will be decided by Trump, and to some degree it will be decided by Iran, and how they decide to engage. Do they want to give Vance and his diplomacy a chance to succeed, or do they want to double down and enlarge the bet, and maybe they think they can get more? But it's all in the hands of Trump eventually. It will be his decision.
We're talking about this here. Obviously, we can sit with Americans and talk with them what's going on in America. But your unique perspective is being here literally on the ground in Israel. Are Israelis, the Israeli public, we've talked about the Israeli leadership, really absorbing this quick change, this quick evolution of what's happening in the United States? Because it's a little illusory. Trump continues. He is the most powerful man in the country. He is continuing to say very supportive things about Israel, underneath the back and forth little fallouts with Netanyahu that he's having. But how aware are Israelis, for instance, that Trump's approval rating is now at 15%, which I just heard in the American media is half of what it was just after January 6th? The noises that Trump is making, the fact that, again, U.S. military and Israeli military seem to be, for now, extremely entwined, and we've got so much military equipment from the United States on our base. Do you think that what is going on in the United States in terms of the evolution with attitudes to Israel has really sunk in here yet?
No. Israelis are looking at the top line, which is what does Trump have to say about us? And they're ignoring this iceberg, which is hidden underneath the daily Trump noise of American negative views of the country. And we have been lucky, to some degree, to have Trump and before him Biden in the White House during these very, very difficult years for Israel, because both Biden and Trump are old school, pro-Israeli, Zionist Americans who grew up with this understanding of Israel as a shelter for the Jewish people and grew up with the memory of the Holocaust. The next generation of American politicians doesn't have that. And Israelis, unfortunately, still don't understand. We write in Haaretz all the time about this coming collision with the iceberg. But not everybody in the Israeli media pays the necessary attention to this issue as much as we do. The collision is coming, whether we are prepared for it or not. The generation of the Trumps and the Bidens and the Schumers and the Pelosis and the Lindsey Grahams who just passed away, that generation will slowly exit the American political scene. And like you said in the beginning, Alison, gradually and then all at once. We will be left with Vance and AOC, and even the more supportive figures in both parties, the Marco Rubios or the Rahm Emanuels, have today a more critical view. I want to remind you that Rubio, in that famous New York Times expose about how the Iran war was adopted by Trump, he reportedly described Netanyahu's sales pitch as bullshit. And he was right, by the way. So we're going to have a lot of problems once this older generation leaves the American political scene, and most Israelis don't understand it yet.
So as we get ready for our own elections, we talk elections endlessly on the elections podcast, so I don't want to focus on politics.
We have an election this year?
Yeah, haven't you heard? It's not going to be at all, you don't think, on voters' minds when they go to the polls, this deterioration, what has been wrought by policies of this government, the outright hostility that the world is feeling towards Israel. You don't think that's going to be any kind of a factor when Israelis cast their ballots?
I don't know, but I tend to think we have so many problems internally today here in Israel.
We do. We have problems internally, Amir.
It's never been a greater time to live here, right? I think those issues are going to dominate. And if anything, the American perspective will enter via Trump's interference. Will he help Netanyahu or not? Will he support him? Will he criticize him? Will he hug him and then embarrass him? There are all kinds of options on the table. Unfortunately, I don't think the more important conversation, which is where do we stand today with the American public, I don't think that's going to be a major part of the election campaign, but it is a crucial question for Israelis to ask, and it's very important for people in this country. And actually, right before we sat down to record this podcast, I was speaking about this in the Haaretz Hebrew podcast, about this exact issue. So I'm not just talking about it here in English to preaching to the choir. I'm also trying to bring this to the attention of people in Israel more broadly. This is going to be a very important question for the future of our alliance with America. It's beyond this politician or that politician. It's American public opinion. It's what Americans think about Israel. That's the bigger issue here.
None of us know exactly what's going to happen. So I'll ask you about what has happened, this whole zigzag resolution, non-resolution of the renewed U.S. conflict with Iran. Was an U.S.-Israeli conflict. For now, we seem to be sitting it out. Trump does not seem to be giving up on the Strait of Hormuz. There was actual panic, I think, in the Israeli military and political upper echelons when it was thought that this memorandum of understanding was going to happen, capitulation to the Iranians. But Trump does not seem to be going there. Do you see endless kind of war of attrition there? Do you think Israel's going to be pulled into the picture either by Trump or Iran? Or should I not be asking you to predict the future?
I can make a prediction, but it will be completely worthless because we're dealing here with Donald Trump. So just to put that on the table, I don't think anyone can foresee if a week from now we are in full-scale war, including Israel, and we're running to bomb shelters again, or if there is a return to negotiations, and we both heard about this new Qatari mediation offer. They want to have a 10-day ceasefire during which the Hormuz line of travel will be open to all the ships with no Iranian intervention, and then they will discuss the future of the Straits. I have no idea which of the two options, or maybe something in the middle will be accepted. But I do think that Netanyahu and Trump have somewhat of a diverging interest here because Trump wants to close this before the midterms. And perhaps he thinks that by bombing the Iranians every night and putting a lot of pressure on them, he will be able to reach a better deal with them. And then maybe through this pressure on them, reach Labor Day with this in the rearview mirror and be able to tell the American public, this is now behind us. For Netanyahu, it's the opposite. Netanyahu would be happy to have war every day until October 27, which is the date of our election. For him, the continuation of the war brings with it the continuation of the promise for total victory.
On the last elections podcast, we were speculating if it might also give him an excuse to postpone elections, delay elections, cancel elections.
So that's in the speculation department. I don't want to go there. But he promised total victory. And right now that has eluded Israel on all fronts. There is no total victory in Gaza. Next to my house in Kibbutz Nahal Oz, there is a lot of military. Thank God. We're happy that the soldiers are there now, unlike October 7. But beyond those soldiers, there are 20,000 Hamas-armed terrorists. Hamas has rebuilt its army of terror. And then if you look up north, it's true that Hezbollah suffered some major defeats with the Beeper operation and with the assassination of Nasrallah, but we saw that it is still a capable organization that was able for many weeks to bombard the entire northern border in Israel and to kill dozens of our soldiers with their drones. That's not what total victory looks like. And then, of course, Iran, still on its feet, still harassing world shipping lanes, still developing ballistic missiles, and we don't know what ended up with the uranium that was supposedly the reason for this entire war. So without the war continuing, the lack of a total victory becomes apparent to all. And what Netanyahu wants to do is to keep the promise. To keep the promise alive, just a little more effort. And for that, he needs the war to continue. And that's where he and Trump perhaps don't see eye to eye.
You mentioned living in Nahal Oz on the Gaza border. Again, you had a very traumatic experience on October 7th. When you look at Gaza now, you look at the current situation, basically Israel in occupation of over 50%, total occupation, Hamas in firm control of the rest of it, this whole plan to rehabilitate Gaza.
The Trump 20-point plan has been abandoned. And I'm very, very disturbed by that. And I really hope that if Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff are listening or watching this podcast, that they will double down on this plan and put a great deal of effort to make it work. And I actually think it would be helpful for Trump politically, but that's not my motivation here. I just think it's important because there is no other plan for Gaza. There's nothing else on the table. It's either moving along with the Trump plan, or at least the parts of it that can be implemented. I understand that we're not going to see tomorrow morning Hamas disarming and Israel withdrawing from Gaza back to the old border. Those two things are probably not happening anytime soon, and I understand that. But there are other elements of this plan, like beginning the reconstruction process in the areas under Israeli control, like allowing Palestinian citizens to move out of Hamas-controlled areas into the areas where you will have new housing and sanitation and all of these things, education, all of these things that barely exist today in the Hamas-controlled parts of Gaza. That has to happen because otherwise Gaza remains a ticking time bomb with Hamas slowly regaining its power and the population suffering really under unbelievable constraints. And that just leads us to a continuation of war, which I, as somebody who is planning to raise my kids there for the coming future, really want to avoid. So Jared, Steve, please reconsider this issue. I know you're busy with Iran as well, but don't forget Gaza.
I have to point out that members of our current government have a very different vision. And just this week, on Monday, our senior ministers, Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, participated in a march of settlers on the border, intending to cross back over and resettle Gaza.
So I'll tell you a funny story about that march. So Monday morning, everybody in Nahal Oz wakes up to a text message from our security team in the kibbutz saying that the military has announced all of the territory between Road 232, that's the main road in the border area, and the border fence, a closed military zone, and that basically includes our kibbutz. So it means we are not allowed to go in and out. It's very confusing. And everybody was now just really worried. People were in panic. What's going on? Well, why is the military making this announcement? Is there some security emergency? Are we preparing for war? And then I received at the same time a message from the IDF spokesperson's unit that was distributed to all the journalists in the country, basically, that the reason for this closure is the march of the far-right politicians toward Gaza, and that the military would like to stop them from running over the border fence. That part was not explained properly to the border communities. So people were in a state of panic. And then I quickly updated our security team that the military has been telling the journalists that this is not because of a security incident in Gaza, it's because of a political incident with our own batch of crazies. And once that was properly explained to the community, people could breathe for a second and feel some relief.
Were they relaxed and angry at the same time?
Yes. By the way, I think mostly angry at the military for not properly explaining this. But that just shows you where we are right now. It's a powder keg. And if proper action is not taken to improve things, it will explode.
I have to ask, what's it like to be back there? You know, some of your neighbors were hostages. Everyone went through this traumatic event. Is it still sort of a shadow that hangs over everyday life? Do people refer to it, or is it back to normal? Like, what's it like?
No. October 7 is still very much felt in Nahal Oz and the entire Gaza border area. The situation today is much better than it was a year ago. We could be sitting here in the studio in July 2025. Our friend Omri Miran was still hostage in the hands of Hamas at the time. Soldiers were getting killed every day. And in Nahal Oz, you would hear the battles, the gunfire, the artillery, the planes. Today, it's not as noisy, although on some nights you still hear explosions and gunfire, and it's not always pleasant, but it's not as bad as it was a year ago. But the memory is still there, and the fear is still there, and the trauma. And I think what is most lacking is a sense of optimism that we will have a better reality a year from today. And again, that's why I think the implementation of the American plan is urgent. Because there has to be some horizon, whether it's for people in Gaza or people in Israel. Where are we going with this? Keeping the situation as it is basically ensuring that there will be another war.
I have to ask you to repeat a really interesting hallway conversation that we had. We passed each other in the hall in the office.
I was on the way to get coffee, and you were on the way to talk about the podcast, I think, with the editor. And then we had this brief conversation, and I told you the Iran war is perhaps more likely than we think.
Right. So we were having the usual Israeli exchange. Will there be war? Won't there be war? Are we going to be in our shelters?
Typical Monday in Israel.
Exactly. Just a usual water cooler conversation. And you just really shared a very interesting observation about the nexus of the publication and accolades for your book and war with Iran. So please share it with the listeners as well.
So last summer, June 2025, I received a message that my book, The Gates of Gaza, had won the Bernstein Prize here in Israel, which is a prize for up-and-coming authors, you can say. And there was supposed to be a ceremony in Shavua Sefer, Israeli Book Week, in Tel Aviv. I was very excited about it, but guess what? The ceremony was postponed because of the June 2025 war with Iran. Eventually, it took place a few weeks later, and during the ceremony, right before I was called to the stage, there was a Houthi missile from Yemen that disrupted the ceremony, and we all had to disperse for a few minutes. So that was last year. Then this winter, I received another nice message that my book had won the Wingate Prize in the UK. It's a prize that has been given for decades to books that portray and explain the Jewish experience to a general audience. I was supposed to fly to London. There was supposed to be a nice ceremony. And then the second Iran war began in February 28. I never made it to London. They celebrated without me. Missed that one. Next week, there's supposed to be in Jerusalem the annual ceremony of the Semi Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature, probably the biggest of the Jewish literary prizes in the world. And I am very honored to have won that prize. I received the news a few weeks ago. And now I'm a bit worried because it's happening next week. And if the past offers us any clues about the future, I just don't want a war with Iran to interfere there. let's just hope that it's not going to be third time a charm, and that the ceremony will be without any disruption this time.
So you must have a particular grudge against both
The world,
sides.
against the world.
Yeah, for the circumstances to interfere with your accolades. They're keeping you in your place.
Alison, I'm just happy that I'm alive and my family is alive and that people are reading our story and connecting from all over the world to it. And I just hope things will remain as quiet as possible here, that there will be no further escalation with Iran, and that some of the attention will properly be given to Gaza.
I thought you were going to say the attention will properly be given to you and your book.
I've had enough attention on that front.
I really hope it happens. I hope you get one, at least, really nice ceremony and get to go up to the stage and receive your prize as you should.
Amen. Toda.
Amir T-Bone, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And that's it for this episode of the Haaretz podcast. Thanks to my guest, opinions editor Amir T-Bone. Thanks to my producer and editor Adi Shacham. Remember, if you want to keep listening and watching the podcast, subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you consume your podcasts. And to keep up with all of the news on Israel, the Middle East, and the Jewish world, and to read all of those great opinion pieces that Amir T-Bone is curating, don't forget to subscribe to and follow haaretz.com. I'm Alison Kaplan-Summer, and until next time, shalom from Tel Aviv. Hello and welcome to the Haaretz podcast. I'm Alison Kaplan-Summer. Well, we've been diving into the election campaign in Israel now for the past month on the Special Election Podcast, but we've done it without an actual date for the election. So this is the first podcast in which we actually know when it's going to happen on October 27th, which is its originally scheduled date. 4 years from the previously held elections. Now, in a normal country, this would be normal, having the date on which it's scheduled. In Israel, it is highly abnormal. There has not been an election taking place on its scheduled date, not an early election because of some sort of crisis within the government, since 1988. So it's been a good run, 38 years of abnormality, and finally we're back to normal, or as close as it can resemble here. Anyway, here to discuss the election with me, all of it, the polls, the events of the previous week, is this week's panel. First, haaretz crack columnist and analyst Joshua Leffer. Josh, thanks for coming to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
And our very special election correspondent on the road. We'll talk soon about what she's up to as she crisscrosses the country. Haaretz correspondent Judy Maltz.
Great to be on, Allison.
It's the first time that both of you have come to the podcast, so welcome to all the fun. So the joke's on us. We've all been speculating for the past 4 years how the situation in the country, October 7th, the Gaza war means for sure this government is going to come down. It's been polling so badly, and we are going to have some kind of elections before the scheduled time now, as I've just explained. It is going to happen on time. There was a lot of talk about how Netanyahu was going to strategically choose another date in the fall. None of that came to pass. I personally am interpreting it as being because Netanyahu feels like he needs every single moment possible in order to maneuver, manipulate, as we say, his tricks and shticks to try to figure out how to possibly win victory out of this election when the polls are not in his favor. Do you have another reason why he would let it go until the very, very end?
No, and he may actually try to start another war with Iran. He probably wants one.
Yeah, I mean, we know that Netanyahu is famously a procrastinator, and so he waited to the last minute for this. But I also think that the polling created a kind of disincentive in the sense that the current coalition knew that if they went to early elections, they would be guaranteed to lose power. And so there was no reason for them to let intra-coalition bickering, for instance, about the ultra-Orthodox draft, bring them down. And then they managed to stick it out to the end of the tenure, which is pretty disgraceful considering how long it has been since a government lasted its full term, and that of all governments, this one is the one that did it. It's pretty damning.
With that said, let's look at the reason why he feels like he needs as much time as possible to raise his standing. Taking a quick look at the polls from the Haaretz election tracker, which averages all of the polls taken by all of the media outlets together. The opposition's fortunes continue to rise. The Jewish opposition parties against Netanyahu now are polling at 59 seats, which is kind of within scratching distance of the 61 seats they would need for a definitive victory. They're in striking distance. Netanyahu's bloc is only polling at 52 seats. That's a very, very large gap. But still, the bottom line is it's a deadlock with no winner unless either side is willing to join with the Arab parties to form a coalition. Also notably, for the first time, the average of all of the polls shows Gadi Eisenkot's Yashar party pulling ahead of the Likud, with Yashar at 23 seats and Likud only with 22. So all of this is happening, of course, while the U.S., or rather I should say Donald Trump and his whim of the moment, lost patience with the memorandum of understanding with Iran, and war is really heating up again, not particularly here, but the U.S. We just heard that 2 U.S. servicemen were killed on a U.S. base in Jordan. Things are really happening between the U.S. and the U.S. bases in the Gulf, and again, right next to Israel, even though the U.S. forces are using Israel as a place, sort of as a base for their weaponry and for refueling, etc. So do we feel like Netanyahu might want Israel to actively re-enter this conflict in order maybe to change the conversation? Or do we think that he thinks that, damage to Israeli quality of life in the form of going back to our bomb shelters, and if Hezbollah comes in, real destruction in the north of Israel will hurt him, not help him? What do you think he's thinking?
We talk on this podcast about Netanyahu 1.0 and Netanyahu 2.0. So Netanyahu 1.0 would be the kind of risk-averse character who would say, having Israelis' routine disrupted, summer vacation ahead of the holidays, ahead of the elections, probably a bad idea. But then there's also Netanyahu 2.0, who is seemingly interested in escalation and willing to gamble more. I think that because the last 2 rounds of fighting in Iran have not been, let's say, to Netanyahu's liking. If certainly they didn't achieve their military objectives, they also didn't achieve their political objectives for him, and that his place in the polls hasn't changed. I think he's probably disinclined to join the round. But, on the other hand, we hear all these kind of quasi-anonymous briefings from defense officials who say that Israel's chomping at the bit to get in, and, they want to finish the job. I mean, one last thing I'll say on this is that Netanyahu, it seemed, and it's always hard to know for sure if this is actually what was happening, but as long as the war with Lebanon continued, many of those border communities in Israel's north were former Likud strongholds. And there was beginning to be a kind of feeling, whether or not it was reality, that there within the ranks of Likud was starting to be a kind of quasi-rebellion, that they wanted Israel to act in some imagined way more forcefully against Hezbollah, and that they were beginning to kind of crumble under the weight of the continued war. And I think that that's another reason why Netanyahu might be cautious, and also why the talks with Lebanon are continuing under American auspices, because that was becoming also a really big electoral liability. All that said, doesn't mean it won't happen. Like, I think that if we had to gamble, we probably should still gamble that there'll be some kind of more explosive escalation.
Judy, you've been on the ground talking to actual people. Do you think it would hurt or help Netanyahu if we went back to war?
I think probably it would hurt Netanyahu because, as Josh just said, especially the north is going to be critical. But clearly, in towns like Kiryat Shmona, which was very much a Likud base, even the mayor had turned against Netanyahu. So I think another round of fighting there now, these people have really, really had it. It's been going on there now for 3 years. It would not help him.
So we tend to go over what's happened in the past week and how it's affecting the election campaign. Josh, the other big event of the past week was this flurry of, people were calling it a blitz of legislation that was passed through the Knesset in its very final days. According to law, the Knesset must dissolve a certain number of days before the election, and that deadline was last week. So I want to go over the legislation that did go through. I think each and every one of them deserves its own podcast. They're all polling as extremely unpopular, so it's kind of hard to fathom why Netanyahu would want them passed and pushed through so badly on the eve of the campaign. I'll quickly roll through them with the most important one last, although they are all pretty important. The first was a contentious bill that curated the authority of the Attorney General, making it so that the Attorney General's opinions are no longer binding on the government as they currently are. A gender segregation bill, a law approving permitting universities to offer gender segregated master's and doctoral degree programs in gender segregated conditions. Right now, there are such segregation in undergraduate. Opponents were very critical of this as a blow to gender equality overall. A broadcasting regulation passing a controversial media reform bill that alters the way that communications are regulated, and it gives the government control with which they will presumably blatantly, already even built into the legislation, favor outlets that toe the government line, Pravda or North Korea style. And then the icing on the cake, really, I think the crux of the matter is this ultra-Orthodox draft and Torah study law. The basic law of Torah study, a temporary measure to freeze arrests and legal action against Haredi ultra-Orthodox draft evaders until November 30th, after the elections. But what's really striking is, at the same time, another law was passed, which the Army just deemed absolutely necessary and said, we have to do this. A temporary law extending mandatory military service from 30 to 32 months. And that's to meet the ongoing security and operational needs with so much going on. So the contrast there of lessening the consequences for ultra-Orthodox young men who don't go to the Army while adding more to the burden of those who go is, infuriating. I would imagine a lot of voters, some of whom would presumably support the coalition. So Josh, why would they do such a thing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'll just point out that 2 of those laws the court has issued an injunction against them. That's the case for the communications law and also for the law that would halt the arrests of ultra-Orthodox draft evaders. Now you're saying, okay, surely this was predictable that laws like this would be challenged by the court. And I think the reason why these laws were passed at the very end of the coalition, my sense is that Netanyahu has actually been afraid that there could be some degree of defection among the ultra-Orthodox, because the coalition agreement of the current government stipulated that a broad draft exemption law would be passed. And that was Netanyahu's promise to the ultra-Orthodox parties.
From the very beginning.
From the very beginning. And he didn't deliver on it. And despite not delivering on it, the ultra-Orthodox parties stayed in the coalition. They threatened and they did all kinds of things to increase the pressure on Netanyahu, but then they didn't bring down the government. They stayed it, we're talking about it. They stayed it the whole term. In the last week, there have been a whole range of interesting, but also probably not electorally significant comments made by ultra-Orthodox leaders. So one of my favorites is one of the spiritual leaders of the Sephardic ultra-Orthodox party, Shas, said Netanyahu can't do tshuva, but maybe Eisenkot can, which a lot of people interpreted as like, okay, so there's beginning to be some kind of preparation for what would it mean to be thinking about a coalition that's not led by Netanyahu. There are rumors that the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox party, which is a coalition of the Hasidic-dominated Agudat Yisrael and the Lithuanian-dominated Degel Torah, that they might not run together. There are all kinds of rumors about new Haredi parties coming, including one by people who are describing themselves as modern Haredim, who are upset with how the way that the current leadership has led the party. So against that backdrop, I think Netanyahu wanted to say, I am the leader of your bloc that you are a part of and have literally signed famously a loyalty oath to me. And, these laws were directed at shoring that up. The other part of this is that not only were two of these laws halted or undergoing a judicial challenge, but the basic law was also watered down. So what the Haredim wanted was a basic law that would enshrine the value of Torah study effectively, maybe even above military service, and that would make it a criteria against which future court decisions would have to take into account, because the basic laws have quasi-constitutional status. And in the end, they settled on a compromise of making this law of merely declarative. And so it's not really clear if it has any actual legal consequences.
They watered it down because of the legal status, or because there were some people inside of Likud or inside the coalition, or maybe even from Smotrich and Ben-Gvir's far-right parties, this population, the National Religious, they serve heavily in the army, and so they, maybe had some strong feelings about this.
That's the political reason why it got watered down, which is that it wasn't going to be in the initial way it was written. It wasn't going to be passable because there was so much resistance within the Likud and among the religious Zionists, and so you ended up with something that's merely declarative. On the other hand, this is also an ultra-Orthodox party or a political thing where the political leadership, because they're feeling the pressure from their base in lots of different directions, want to be able to show, look, we stuck it out with this government. We know that the conditions aren't great. And one of the things I think people maybe don't appreciate is that the consequences of there not being a draft exemption law have been quite substantial for the ultra-Orthodox public. The draft evaders are getting arrested. A lot of the social benefits that were arranged for the ultra-Orthodox public have been curtailed in the absence of a law regularizing their non-drafting. And so within the ultra-Orthodox public, there's a feeling of a real social crisis. And there's a lot of pressure on the current leadership to show that it's doing something. So these laws, in addition to shoring up the ultra-Orthodox party support for Netanyahu, are also meant for the current very embattled leadership of the Haredi parties to say, look, we got the goods. Don't rebel against us. We'll see whether that works. Currently, there aren't other options, and so I think that the rebellion's not going to happen.
Judy, on the ground, the real people, are they talking about this stuff?
Oh, yeah. I was just in Kfar Chabad last week and the previous week. So, yeah, they are talking about that. That's a big issue for them.
And what were they saying to you?
Well, they officially don't talk politics in Kfar Chabad. And officially, they are in favor of joining the army. But they actually don't really serve in the army, or many of them don't. But officially, they want to, quote unquote, finish the job in Gaza, Lebanon, and Iran.
They want someone else to do it?
Exactly.
Kfar Chabad, we'll just say, is a super interesting place. It's arguably the single most right-wing municipality in Israel.
It's not, I think
it is, right?
It's Ben-Gvir country.
That captures a certain paradox that people are talking about in the upcoming elections, which is that part of the Haredi public is super duper right wing. So on the one hand, you have, we don't want to serve, we view the secular army as a threat to our way of life. On the other hand, quite extreme rhetoric. And the party that is currently best positioned, or that is going to hope to exploit that, is going to be Ben Gvir's party. I actually was randomly on a Haredi news site and a poll popped up. And as I'm doing it, I'm realizing that the questions are basically to try to, they think, okay, we're doing this poll of people who are reading an Israeli Haredi news site to see what the possibility is for a extremely hawkish on policy, like a Ben Gvir aligned political entity, but that also doesn't want the approach of the current religious Zionist camp, which is the Haredim have to serve. I don't think it would be crazy to see a greater share of ultra-Orthodox voters voting for Ben Gvir, including, like, one of the paradoxes, again, and with the population is the more modern you are in the ultra-Orthodox world, actually the more politically right-wing you tend to be. That openness is not necessarily correlated in this instance with political liberalism.
And we're talking about bleeding into the ultra-Orthodox nationalistic population that might actually serve in the army?
Those voters are pretty squarely in the Smotrich nationalist Haredi, or what they call Chardalim. I think we're talking more people who currently maybe vote for Shas. Let's say working class Sephardi Mizrahi voters. Many of Shas's own voters serve in the army. I think that they are one of the parties that receive the most votes from currently enlisted soldiers in elections. And so, that's something that's also to keep an eye on. One of the other parties that gets a lot of votes from soldiers is Ben Gvir.
I want to transition into Judy Maltz's great adventure from now until Election Day.
I love that title, Allison.
Traveling across the country to various cities to take the pulse ahead of the elections. So far, you've been to Ra'anana, Rahat, Haifa, Alon Shvut, Your pieces from there have been published. You've also reported from Sderot, Kfar Chabad, as we just spoke about, and Arad. Those are all to come, and many more between now and October 27th, and all in the summer heat. So, your feet must be tired.
Yeah, it's exhausting, but it's been, I don't want to use the word fun, because what's happening in this country isn't fun right now, but it's been eye-opening, and I love reporting on the ground. There's so many different factors that could affect the outcome of this election. So it's been like a great opportunity to test out all sorts of theories that we've been reading about and actually talking to people on the ground about them and how they're going to influence their votes.
Why do this? The big movie, The Odyssey, just opened, so I keep thinking of what you're doing as an Odyssey.
I love that one too, yeah.
So what was your goal? Like, why did you decide you wanted to do this?
First of all, I also follow the polls really closely. I'm a fanatic about it. I wait until the TV channels publish their polls and wait for Friday's papers. But also, we know that, the polls are good for that moment in time. And there's so many different factors at work here. For example, voter turnout in the Arab sector, how young Israelis will vote, we call them religious Zionists. Maybe we can call them modern Orthodox. The more liberal, how do they feel about the direction their sectoral party has taken? In the Arab sector, I've been both to Rahat, which is a Bedouin city, and Al-Fahim, which is large Muslim Arab city up north. And how do they feel about the parties that are supposed to represent them? There's actually 4 Arab parties. It's not clear whether they're going to run together. How would that affect voter turnout? I was just in Sderot last week, and that was a place where I really wanted to explore how the trauma of October 7th, which they very much felt down there, how has that affected views there? So in every place I go, there's another issue I'm looking at, something pretty specific. And we were just talking about Ben Gvir and Chabad. So yeah, I think there's a consensus pretty much around Israel that Ben Gvir has been a failure in his role as Minister of National Security. He's in charge of the police. That's basically what that role is, because the number of crimes in Israel is unprecedented under his tenure. Murders, rapes, theft, things are out of control here. So I thought, okay, it would be interesting to go back to Kfar Chabad nearly 4 years later and ask people there, which, as we mentioned before, there was a lot of support for him there. How do they feel about that? Are they going to vote for him again? Surprisingly, I'm not going to give too much away because I haven't published the piece yet, but they actually think he's been a great success as a minister in charge of the police.
Were there things that, besides this revelation, other discoveries in your reporting that surprised you? For example, maybe in the Arab sector, in Rahat and al-Fahim?
Yeah. So what's interesting there, Rahat is the largest Arab city in Israel, and al-Fahim is the third largest. And in Rahat, it's a completely different story there. What really impressed me there is that in both places, people are really, really angry with this government. In Rahat, it seems that will be expressed through a very high voter turnout rate. In al-Fahim, on the other hand, this anger is being translated into a sense of despair where so many people I spoke with, especially young Arabs, they have no inclination whatsoever to vote, which is really sad.
And there's ideological boycotting. We don't believe in the state and it shouldn't exist, so why should we participate in the election?
There's also that, and there's also anger at their own Arab parties for not coming together as one big force, and instead of bickering with one another, like putting some agenda out there that will help this population. But going back to your question, was there anything that surprised me in these places? Yes. What surprised me actually is that I found there were more than I expected pockets of support there, also in Haifa, where you have a relatively large Arab population, pockets of support for the Democrats' Party, which I had not been expecting. Even in Rahat, a Bedouin city. I wonder whether this support is being taken into account in the surveys that we are seeing, because it may surprise us in the end.
It's interesting. Our Palestinian-Israeli correspondent, Naram Zbidat, was on the podcast, and she actually said a similar thing, that she knows of her generation. She's quite young, people who are thinking of voting strategically for the Democrats. That's interesting. Do you have any theories as to why, Josh?
I mean, I think that there, not so long ago, in recent memory, Meretz had a very charismatic Palestinian State of Israel representative, and Isawi Fridge, and generally Meretz took an estimated probably 1+ seats from Palestinian citizens of Israel. And I think that it would not surprise me. I think in part because there's a lot of disillusionment with the established parties, and there is a sense of energy among some of the Arab candidates on the Democrats list. I think that we shouldn't be surprised if maybe even two more. I don't know.
Josh, that's a really good point. And I'm looking forward to hearing the results of the primaries of the Democrats, because I think that is going to be one of the really interesting things, is to see who, if any of the Arab candidates do get into that list of their top 8 on the party slate. You mentioned Isawi Freish. There's also Ali Salalha, who's the school principal from Beit Jan, and he was also a member of Meretz. So it's going to be interesting. It has a lot to do with the fact that it's probably the only party of the opposition parties that actually said, we welcome a coalition with Arab parties. We have nothing against that. They've embraced this warmly.
So, Judy, let's hear some of the interviews you did in English, because some of your interviewees spoke English, particularly in the city of Ra'anana, where I'm from, where we have an outsized number of native English speakers. You spoke in Ra'anana with Anita Lavor, who was a Yesh Atid voter, and she kind of talked about her shock and horror at the current government.
I have been following this for years, and what shocked me in January was that he brought the most extreme people into government. When you talk that Benville, Netanyahu he used to turn his back on him. So not only to bring him in, but to put him in the position that he did which has endangered us all physically and our reputation. So sometimes I wonder if I'll ever be able to travel to another country again. Maybe I'm being unrealistic, but I kind of believe that there's no way that could happen again.
This was a woman who still held with her the yellow ribbon pin for the hostages. And it was very interesting when we started the interview. She pulled it out and she says, "This is what I am going to be thinking about when I head to the polls." At that time, we didn't know when it would be, but when the election is held, I will remember who abandoned our hostages, which I think says a lot.
She voted for Yesh Atid last time, and she would not tell you who she's thinking of voting for this time. She said she hadn't decided yet, right?
Yeah, as far as I remember, she hadn't decided. I think she was leaning toward the Democrats.
I'm sure. And here's another interviewee, this one a right-wing settler from Alon Shvut. He's discussing his debate between supporting one of the coalition's right-wing parties and choosing another direction related to what Josh was talking about and what people are talking about as the soft right, the traditional Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir type voters who may be considering this time to throw in their lot with Gadi Eisenkot.
There was a time where I personally supported Smotrich. He lost, I'll tell you more than that. On paper, my positions are probably closest to his than any other party in the current Knesset. In spite of that, I voted against him last time. I voted Benny Gantz as the least bad option, so to speak, because I felt then, and I feel even more strongly now, that what Israel needs is people that are going to be responsible, and they're going to talk responsibly, and they're going to try to build bridges instead of trying to defeat the other side. So my positions are, but not as much as just positions. Legalizing settlements, all these new chavot, which people on the left are up in arms about. That I put to his credit. I think I'm totally with him there. I'm not with Ben-Gvir and all the violence. 100%. I want Ribonut. I want a black Palestinian state. 100%. But Smotrich fell into the trap of way too many Israeli politicians that, you try to stay in power by getting us to fight with each other.
This Rabbi Alan Haber, who I spoke with, he said he totally supports Smotrich's policies and his positions, but he did not vote for him in the past, and he will not vote for him now because he considers him very divisive. And he doesn't want divisive people in leadership in Israel. But I think the interesting thing in Alon Shvut, and now Alon Shvut is sometimes referred to as a left-wing settlement, because even though I think it was more than 40% there voted last time for the religious Zionism, which is the Smotrich Ben-Gvir party, it was significantly lower than in many of the other settlements. But there, people are conflicted because, on the one hand, they're very angry at Smotrich and the party for supporting this draft exemption bill for the ultra-Orthodox, because they do see it as a very important value in Israel, serving in the army, and they always talk about how many members of the religious Zionist community were killed in the war, were injured, and how much they contribute to the army. So it really, really bothers them and angers them that the party that is supposed to represent this community voted in favor of or supports this bill. On the other hand, they will tell you there has been nobody in history who has done more for us in preventing the establishment of a Palestinian state than Smotrich, because he has expanded the settlements and he has empowered the Hilltop youth and done everything. He's given them more than any other minister. So they don't know. Should they vote for him or shouldn't they?
Finally, in Haifa, you spoke with an Arab-Israeli activist, Eli Badran, and what he told you sounds pretty sobering.
As an Arab, Palestinian, Christian who lives in Israel, and I'm very proud of my identity, I know that what I'm looking at is a way out and not a commitment to the Knesset or any government, a way to leave this country. Unfortunately, and I'm saying this with the most painful feelings, it's something like it squeezes me to say this, but I think that many people, not only Christians, but I think that many educated people who can really bring change to this country from all sides, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, whatever, they are having the same thoughts and emotion. We can't take it anymore. We've had enough. We are persecuted so hard that I don't see if I want, maybe I will stay, but I'm not sure I want my children.
Yes, he said he basically had given up hope of any change in this country. He said, maybe I'll leave, and if I don't leave, I want my children to get out of here. And he said for the first time in his life, he was not planning to vote in the election. However, when he was pressed, and this happened with other people in other places, when I asked them, are you sure you're not going to vote? Are you sure? The answer is, I'll decide on election day. In other words, hold me back. Hold me back.
Are people, Josh, speaking in equally apocalyptic terms about this election? I'll leave if it doesn't happen. The country is finished if it turns out this way or that way.
So I would say that the people I know are split between very optimistic people and apocalyptic. And I want to give a voice to the optimism. And I maybe this is just me and my immediate circle, but on the one hand, the polls have been super duper consistent. But I have begun to think that the polling is not telling the whole story. And one of the reasons why I don't think the polls tell the whole story is we know from American politics that, especially in the digital era, polls can be wrong. And the one thing that polls often underestimate are people who are not following politics super closely, who have unconventional, not confused views, and ordinary people who don't follow politics every day. There are fewer of them in Israel because Israel is super politicized, but there are more than I think there are more of those people than we realize at this point, who say something like, whether it's for disillusionment reasons or lack of clarity reasons or confusion, I don't know who I'm going to vote for, and I'm going to make up the decision basically the day of. So the optimistic scenario would be, I think that the polls are overstating the current support for the coalition. I'm willing to gamble out and say that I actually think that there are going to be more people than we realize who are going to get into the voting booth and are going to say, have the last 4 years been good? And they're going to have unless they're very ideological people who are super on board with the Smotrich agenda or super on board with those people are not going to be converted. But a lot of people who reflexively have maybe voted for the coalition parties, maybe not, I don't know. I can't give you a number.
Probably Likud more than any of the others.
Likud is the most vulnerable party in this because their voters tend to not be, they have right-wing views, but they're not institutionally affiliated in an ideological sense. We'll go in and we'll say, you know what? Maybe it's time for a change. And I think that also the more time that Eisenkot is above Likud in the polls creates a kind of momentum, self-fulfilling prophecy, because all of a sudden you have people who are beginning to imagine an Israel that's not led by Netanyahu. And Netanyahu has benefited from the fact that people, including most young people, have not known any Israel people in their 40s haven't known an Israel, really. That's not led by Netanyahu for the most part. And once there is the possibility of imagining what that might look like a little bit more concretely, I am relatively confident, this is the optimistic scenario, that I don't like using this metaphor, but I think it's apt, that there will be basically a fire sale in Netanyahu's stock. And we're already seeing this in a very interesting poll, which hasn't quite caught up to the party poll, which is in polls about fitness for the office of the prime minister. Eisenkot's opened up a relatively significant gap over Netanyahu. The longer we're in those conditions, I think that the scenario in which voters who are, let's say, I don't like this term, but we have to use it, low information in the American parlance I think are likely to get caught up in the momentum. The apocalyptic scenario, of course, is that, we just all got alerts that maybe there will be sirens because there's missile strikes against Jordan, and so that might set off sirens in southern Israel. Is it possible that there's an escalation and that escalation lasts into the election period, and then there's an excuse about postponing the elections, and we end up in the kind of emergency thing? And I was just talking with this with another friend and also with my wife, and we were like, what? Let's say there aren't free and fair elections in Israel. What are we going to do? And that is I think, certainly people I know who are in the space between the Democrats and further to their left are we have to prepare for this scenario. There's no way Netanyahu is going to go to the elections knowing that he's going to almost certainly lose them. And I think that right now, I think that's too alarmist, and I'm willing to gamble more on the optimistic scenario. But again, after everything we've experienced over the last 4 years, can we rule out that apocalyptic scenario? We can't rule it out, sadly.
So interestingly, in Sderot, which has been for many, many years a Likud stronghold, there was a very short period in the 80s where they had a Labor Party mayor, Amir Peretz, who eventually led the party and was defense minister. But your classic sort of development town, even though officially right now it's a city. And what I heard there is, at least among the older generation, there is growing support for Eisenkot because they see him as one of them. He's Mizrahi. He comes from the geographic periphery of Israel. And the fact that he lost a son in the war, those are things that are very significant for them. So young people in Sderot, they may move from Likud, but to Ben Gvir. But for the older generation, something about Eisenkot really resonates with them.
Our colleague, Hillel Glazer, wrote a really big profile of kind of Eisenkot's campaign in the traditional Likud stronghold periphery. And, one of the things that stuck in my mind came to me after I read an anecdote of his reporting about being in Dimona, which is a place in the periphery that votes 85% parties of the coalition, and Likud and Ben Gvir being big proportions of that vote. And, you start to think strategically, and if Eisenkot could win only 30% of that city, then you're looking at a very different political reality than the one that we're used to in the past. Now, that's a huge if, because you also have the same possibility that people get into the voting box and they say, I voted Likud all my life. There's no way I'm not going to vote Likud. It's true. Eisenkot, he's a really nice guy. Respect his contribution, his loss, his bereavement, all of these symbolic things. So that could happen. But I think that we should pay attention to these these stories that people are saying about the connection that people are feeling to Eisenkot, the way that he does represent. I think people feel this in the street, but it's not yet being expressed to its fullest extent, and it's still early, right? What it would mean for Israel to have a Tiberius-born, Eilat-raised son of Moroccan immigrants be the prime minister. And I think that there are people who are excited about that. Eisenkot doesn't like to talk about it, which I think is a good strategic choice. But the fact that other people are talking about it for him is beginning to, I think, generate some of that. Obviously, Dimona is never going to vote it's not going to flip. You're not going to flip Dimona. But if you can shave off the margins, then you are looking at a different kind of political reality.
They've always related to Netanyahu and identified with him, but he's never really been one of them. And an Eisenkot might actually, appear as one of them. We are going to have to leave it here, somewhere on the spectrum between optimism and the apocalypse. I really enjoyed having both of you on this podcast. Thank you guys for joining me.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks, Allison.
And that's it for this episode of the Haaretz podcast. To read any of the interesting references we spoke about in this podcast, from the Hillel Glazer feature on Gadi Eisenkot to Judy's many articles about traversing the country, and of course for Joshua's sharp analysis, please don't forget to follow, read, subscribe to haaretz.com. And as for the podcast, don't forget to subscribe to us and listen to us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or watch us on YouTube. Thank you so much to both of my guests, to Joshua Leffer and to Judy Maltz, and to producer and editor Adi Shacham. I'm Allison Kaplan-Summer, and until next time, shalom from Tel Aviv. Hello and welcome to the Haaretz podcast. I'm Allison Kaplan-Summer. Congressman Ro Khanna's visit to the West Bank may have only lasted for 3 days, but its impact and aftermath has and will last far longer than that. On July 11th, just after his return to the United States, the California congressman who represents a district in Silicon Valley posted on his media platforms that Israeli settlers brandishing American-made M4s detained me and other Americans on my trip to Palestine. When the IDF arrived, they sided with the settlers and continued our detention. They made a huge mistake. On the same day, a story appeared in the New York Times. American politician blocked by Israeli settlers in the West Bank. Where past U.S. leaders toured the region to show support for Israel, today's Democratic presidential aspirants are going to bolster their credentials as critics. And indeed, Khanna is a much referred to aspirant for the 2028 Democratic nomination for the presidency. In the days since the incident, there has been an intense back and forth over it, every moment of which has been put under a microscope between Israel and its defenders and Congressman Khanna, who has said that every American should be outraged by what happened and called for the arrest of both the settlers and soldiers who, he said, took the side of the settlers. I'm very pleased that the congressman and the possible 2028 presidential candidate has agreed to come on the Haaretz podcast to discuss not only that incident, but the huge shift in policy positions regarding Israel happening in the Democratic Party and whether the post-October 7th years of war have changed his own political perspective. Congressman Khanna, welcome to the Haaretz podcast, and thank you so much for agreeing to join us.
Thank you. They tell me you're the oldest daily newspaper in Israel. Is that correct?
Absolutely, absolutely. Since many decades before the founding of the state.
But the government doesn't like
existed.
you, apparently.
The governments in many countries are not big fans of the free press. You might have noticed that. Congressman, all of your interviews so far have been hyper-focused on this one incident, but I would like to start at the beginning so we can put it into context. Why did you make this trip at this time, and what were you trying to accomplish? I ask because there have been so many wild accusations that this incident was a publicity stunt and somehow getting a confrontation on camera was the purpose of your visit. So can you just start with who initiated and coordinated this trip? What did you do in your 3 days, and why did you come?
I wanted to see the occupation from the lens of the Palestinians. I have been to Israel 3 times before. I met with Prime Minister Bennett and Prime Minister Netanyahu. I had come on a delegation with Speaker Pelosi, with the Armed Services Committee. And many years back, I had actually come on Project Interchange with the AJC, with a group of Indian Americans around 2005. But all the times I came, we would go once to Ramallah, met with President Abbas, met with business leaders, but I never really saw the occupation from the lens of Palestinians. And so I was talking to Jasper Nathaniel. He's a journalist who's in the occupied West Bank. And he said, come while I'm here. We'll get you Palestinian-led guide and perspectives. And you'll really be able to see firsthand how devastating life is for Palestinians and Palestinian Americans. So that is why I went on this trip.
So when this now famous incident happened, however, you were being guided by an Israeli, by a member of Breaking the Silence, that activist organization, right?
Well, we were largely on a trip led by Palestinians. We went to Hebron, the Palestinian side, led by a Palestinian. We were in places in villages where Palestinians and Palestinian Americans invited us into their homes. We were in Beit Zahur and Bethlehem and Beit Jala, where we met with Palestinian leaders. But Nadav, who's done incredible work at breaking the silence, said, I want to take you to this village, Zanuda, that has been destroyed by the extremist settlers, Yanan Levy and others. And I want you to see the elementary school so you can see settler violence firsthand. And so for that portion of a few hours, Nadav took us there. The irony is that was the most routine part of the trip. He had taken Congresswoman DeLaura and Congressman Kasten there 4 or 5 months ago without incident. And so we got onto a van with him. There were 2 other Americans with me, Cam Kasky and Ben Linder, Jewish Americans, some Palestinians. And there was a New York Times photographer with us the whole day because she was documenting my trip. She was with us in Hebron and other parts of that day to see what it was like seeing the West Bank through the lens of Palestinians.
So with that all said, can you go over again, sort of step by step, what happened to you?
Well, it's not very controversial. I don't know why Israel just doesn't take accountability, apologize, have investigations, and move on. The reality is we were at Zanuda village. There were 2 extremist settlers who came up, one brandishing an M4. We were quickly told to get into our van, and they blocked our van from exiting. You can't do that. I mean, I've called it detainment. You could call it false imprisonment. The bottom line is we couldn't leave the road. There were no signs there. There was nothing that says that it was a restricted zone. If anything, the restrictions were on extreme settlers who had destroyed that village. And like I said, members of Congress came before. Now, first, the IDF put out a statement saying it was a restrictive zone. Now they've walked that back, and the Jerusalem Post has concluded that it was not a restricted area. And now they're saying, well, the extreme settlers thought it was restricted. Well, even on that account, they basically detained us with a false assumption about the site. And they were cursing at us. They were kicking our tires. They were laughing at us, wiping our windshields. They didn't let us go, even when we said we were in the American embassy. They called other extremist settlers, their friends, who further detained us, blocked us in. And then when the IDF came, the IDF also said, no, we believe the settlers. We are not going to let you through. And it really took David Brownstein at the American Embassy, the number 2 person, calling a senior person in the Israeli Foreign Service or whoever he called that led the Israeli police to come, at which point they scattered 75 to 90 minutes into it.
Yes. So when the IDF statement came out saying that the soldiers had dispersed the settlers, you basically said that was a lie.
But that is a lie. And the Jerusalem Post shows it's a lie. Even now, they've walked that back. I mean, the IDF and the video camera shows they didn't disperse the settlers. So I'm actually probably even more disturbed about the government's lies than I am about the incident itself that was harrowing. But, one of my, Cam Kasky, had a panic attack on my team. He's a Parkland survivor. Ben Linder, a Jewish American, also wrote about how harrowing the experience was. Nadav has talked about it. It's not just me. It's a lot of other folks. And that's why the New York Times talked to our security person. The reporter talked to the New York Times photographer who was there and was thoroughly reported. And then the IDF basically lied. And to this day, we have not had a commitment to investigate those settlers. At the very least, the settlers need to be investigated. You can't just be a civilian and block any person from leaving and brandish M4 guns and mocking them and think that's acceptable. Even if it was a restricted zone, you couldn't do that. Well, it turns out it wasn't a restricted zone, but that's vigilante justice. They need to be investigated and prosecuted. My suspicion, from what I've been told, is that they're connected to Yanan Levy. He needs to be investigated and prosecuted, not just for what he did to Zanuda village, not just if he had a connection to those extreme settlers, but also for his murder of Ottawa. And I met Ottawa's brother, Khalil. And this guy is still roaming around, free. I mean, it's like the law of the jungle. And his outpost needs to be demolished. So I'm going to be meeting the ambassador. The ambassador said he wants to meet with me, and these are going to be my very simple demands. And then we need to have an investigation on those 4 IDF officers. Why were they not letting us through? Why did they take the side of the settlers?
Yes, the Israeli ambassador to the U.S., Yechiel Leiter, wasn't very nice to you on his comments in the media. He said the whole thing was concocted somehow to distract from the scandal around former Senate candidate Graham Plattner, who you supported. And he said it was suspicious that it happened on Wednesday and that you only went public with it on Saturday and not in real time.
Well, with due respect to the ambassador, he doesn't really understand American politics. If he did, then Israel's approval ratings wouldn't be as low as they are. The reason that it was reported on Saturday is that we did not want to have any news break until I was out of Israel, and the New York Times respected that. And so we were on Thursday still in the West Bank going to Palestinian areas. And in some cases, after we left certain of these towns, I don't remember the names off the top of my head, settlers came an hour later. So I didn't want to be out there saying I was, for security reasons, in the West Bank. And then the New York Times on Friday was verifying the reporting. They were talking to our security guard, to the New York Times photographer, to other people in the delegation. So they knew it would be a very sensitive report, and they wanted to get the facts right. And that's why we waited till the New York Times report came out. And that came out, I think, Saturday morning.
What did you think of Prime Minister Netanyahu's response on Meet the Press that settler terror is merely 150 juvenile delinquents that are not really part of the settler community? He said that actually in several U.S. media interviews, and downplays their activities, saying it pales in comparison to Palestinian terror.
Well, first of all, this is just his talking point, but let's just take him at face value that he's calling these juvenile delinquents. Why haven't they been arrested? Their pictures are all over social media. My understanding is that they're connected to Yanan Levy. Why has Yanan Levy not been arrested? I can give you the names of other extremist settlers for having talked to Palestinians and Palestinian Americans. But the next American president will demand the arrest of these violent settlers. This is not going to be some dialogue with Israel. It will be a clear directive to Israel that they need to arrest these violent settlers. They need to demolish the outposts. They need to stop the terrorizing of the Palestinian people. I met a Palestinian father who was grieving for his 14-year-old Palestinian-American son. His Palestinian-American son, born, raised in the United States, came to the West Bank. The father admits that he threw rocks at one of the cars, but the IDF soldiers shot him 21 times for throwing rocks. And he has had no justice, no investigation. And he was talking about how the room of his son is still the same, not changed. I went to a school that had a shooting. Principal showed me the blood of the 14-year-old, 15-year-old who was killed. And he was never consulted by the IDF or the police. He still doesn't know if that shooter is out in and free. I met a family, Salman family in El Khair, whose house every night is attacked by settlers, every other night. The 18-year-old daughter was studying, can't study there anymore. Windows rattled, an Israeli flag planted on a Palestinian home. It is inhumane and cruel what's going on. People in Hebron throwing rotten tomatoes, throwing acid, urinating on Palestinian shopkeepers. If you want to see the cruelty of humanity, go spend a day in the occupied West Bank.
What do you say to those like Netanyahu, however, who say that you don't balance it with the cruelty of the other side of Palestinians towards Israelis?
First of all, I'll say that there has to be an end to the occupation and justice in the West Bank and in Gaza. I have always believed and still believe in Jewish self-determination, in a secure Israel is a Jewish democratic state with equal rights, which treat people with equality and dignity. And I condemned Hamas as a terrorist organization. I condemned Hezbollah's terrorism. I've condemned the October 7th terrorist attacks. I have met with people in my office, with John and Rachel Poland, who lost their beloved son Hirsch. I did my very, very, very little part to try to advocate for the release of Hirsch. Obviously, he was brutally murdered. My heart breaks for the families of the hostages. My heart breaks for the victims of October 7th. But I want a way forward for peace, for a secure democratic Israel living side by side with a Palestinian people and a Palestinian state where we can have a just peace.
You make no secret of the fact that you're weighing a bid for the presidency in 2028. I really appreciate, your passion and your commitment to this issue, and that it is genuinely, touching you and moving you, and you want to do something about it. But in cold political terms, I'm curious. Israel-Palestine has always been kind of a niche issue with voters and very rarely at the top of concerns when they actually vote. Do you believe that things have changed, that this is not the case, that when it comes to voters, especially Democratic voters, that this is a top tier issue? And do you think it's resonant enough to make it such a key element of your potential presidential campaign?
Well, my core focus is economic patriotism. How do we tackle the wealth inequality in our country? I represent Silicon Valley. I grew up in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. I saw Fearless Work shut down. I saw steel plants shut down. I've seen wealth concentrate in the hands of a few in my district. And I believe that we need a new deal in America. We need a Marshall Plan for America where we have economic security, economic dignity for people across this country. And a lot of my work has been on those economic issues. But I also believe that we need an America that is moral and has moral leadership in the world. And my view is that the issue of Palestine and the injustice in Palestine has become a rallying cry for whether you believe in a moral American foreign policy, whether you believe in standing for principle and not being influenced by lobby groups or the status quo powers to be.
Yeah, you spoke about lobby groups. In June, you became the first sitting member of Congress to sign a formal pledge refusing to accept donations or even political support from AIPAC, and explicitly campaigning in this pledge that you signed against the influence of pro-Israel AIPAC money. Defenders of AIPAC say that, hey, Americans joined together in PACs to support all kinds of causes they believe in, gun control, climate change, even Middle East peace. J Street has a PAC. So they say, why shouldn't supporters of Israeli policy do the same? Is it the principle of AIPAC, or is it just the scale of AIPAC's influence that you object to?
Well, I object to all PAC money. I have been for banning super PACs. I don't take a single dime of PAC money or lobbyist money. I'm for getting all of that money out of our political system. And I'm for a constitutional amendment to regulate large amounts of private spending. It has no place in our politics. I don't question the American citizens' right who are pro-Israel to join AIPAC and play under the rules of the system. The system is broken, and I have been for banishing all PAC money. But I also, as an American politician, have the right to not take their financial support, just like I would not take support from a big oil PAC or from the NRA. So I don't say that AIPAC can't participate in politics. I don't question the loyalty of an American citizen who is very the Netanyahu government and wants to advocate for that. They have every right to do that. And I have every right to say that I don't want their support.
Have the years of war since October 7th, the experience of watching what's happened in Gaza and perhaps what you're observing now in the West Bank, has it changed your fundamental positions on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? You stated them a little bit earlier in this interview. In the past, you've defined yourself as supporting Zionism, Israel's right to exist, and you even said that it's anti-Semitic to oppose the existence of a Jewish state, which essentially is Zoran Mamdani's position. In the past, you've also not supported the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. I'm just wondering, you've been much more outspoken on the Palestinian issue in recent months, years. Do you feel like something's fundamentally changed in you since before October 7th, 2023?
Yes. And initially, my sympathy, if you look in my statements in the first couple months after October 7th, were all with Israel, with the horrific terrorist attack, with the hostages. I was sickened by what happened. But the response in Gaza was so disproportionate, so inhumane, that it just really affected me, seeing the children being killed. I was in Dearborn at the Wall of Tears, and there is a wall with the names of the children, about 18,000 children, all with their ages. And that deeply affected me, the genocide, as I have called it, in Gaza. I believe it was a genocide, but even if people who don't believe it was a genocide, I mean, it certainly was just awful, awful crimes, and the pushing of the Palestinian population all the way down to southern Gaza. And I was deeply affected with this trip to the West Bank and seeing how Palestinians are being treated. Now, I want to move forward towards a peace, and I believe that we can get there if we stop the aid to Israel, if we stop military sales that are being used to kill civilians, if we demand, not request, but demand the arrest of violent settlers. That's something that can happen in 100 days. You don't need a long peace process for that. If we demand the removal of these outposts, if we begin to demand the removal of illegal settlements, even under Israeli law, if we begin to sanction the banks and the construction companies that are continuing to build there, and then if we work towards a peace process modeled after the Arab peace plan on what a Palestinian state would look like. There may be some settlement swaps where you have some settlements near Jerusalem there that are part of Israel and others Palestinians in Israel that become part of Palestine. There are a lot of creative ways of doing that. But I do believe that you can keep Israel as a Jewish democratic state if you end the occupation and the apartheid there, and if you have a Jewish state that has equal rights. I mean, you have England, for example, with the Church of England working towards having equal rights for British citizens. And the hope would be to have a Jewish state with equal rights and end the occupation, and a Palestinian state as well.
You still believe a two-state solution is not only desirable but possible?
I think it's much harder than I anticipated, but you know, it's possible to get to a Palestinian state with some of the land swaps and stopping the settlements. But I also believe that there are things we can do immediately, right? Part of the challenge is we keep talking about the hypotheticals of peace. What are we doing to eliminate the outposts, to arrest the violent settlers, to allow Palestinians to drill for water, to make sure that they aren't subject to the cruelty of the checkpoints? So I would argue that the next American administration needs to work towards justice now, while adopting a broader framework for peace. I do think the conditions on the ground make a two-state solution much harder, and every new settlement that goes up makes it harder. But I still believe that Arab peace plan has some possibility of working, and we've not tried it. We've not really had an American administration, probably since George Bush Sr., who has put real pressure on the Israeli government to get to a peace.
Back to the issue of military aid. Together with Republican Congressman Thomas Massie, you have been leading the charge to strip the National Defense Authorization Act of Section 224, which would deeply intertwine the U.S. and Israeli militaries' unprecedented integration of the weapons industry and wider industries. Are you still part of that fight? And I'm also interested, you said that you believe in ending military aid. Netanyahu is a little bit on the same page with that. He wants to move the dynamic from aid to partnership, and that's why obviously he's in favor of this section of the act. Can you clarify your position?
Well, I'm for ending all military aid. I didn't know Netanyahu was for that too. He should endorse the Massie Amendment if he's for that, and we'll get more votes for it this week because that's what the Massie Amendment does. It zeroes out all aid to Israel, military aid. So
he says he wants it phased out, and he says he wants it to transform from aid to partnership, and that this act and the section of the act kind of personifies the partnership
Well, if he's sincere about that, he should endorse the Massie Amendment. I'll wait after this interview for him to announce the arrest of the settlers who detained us and the endorsement of the Massie Amendment. But beyond that, we can't have Section 224 or Section 219, which is kind of Netanyahu's clever ploy, which is to basically integrate America's military with Israel's military and joint produce all the weapons and compromise American sovereignty. And that would allow for the sale of these. You wouldn't even need the sale. That would allow for Israel to get these weapons, bypassing American foreign sale laws. And I led the effort with Massie to strip Section 224 from the House Armed Services Bill. I did it in the Armed Services Committee, which I've been a senior member now. I've been on the committee for 10 years. And I will continue to work to make sure that we don't have that kind of integration. But you know, one message I would give, and I gave this message to the Prime Minister, not that he probably cares much about what I think, but when I met him in 2024, and I said, Mr. Prime Minister, you may have won certain battles, but you've lost the war. And I want your readers to really understand this. Israel has lost Americans under 50. They've lost them. Not just Democrats, but Republicans. Thomas Massie won young Republicans by 30 points. And I just don't understand what the calculus is, because these young Americans are going to be the future members of Congress and senators and presidents, not just in 2028, but in 2032 and 2036 and 2040. And it is one of the most foolish strategies to have antagonized an entire American generation. And that's what Bibi Netanyahu has accomplished.
You have a lot of opportunities to speak to Israelis. You're speaking here to Israel's leaders, but you have a lot of expat Israelis in your district in Silicon Valley, so you must interact a great deal with Israelis. What do you say to them, and what do you say on this podcast, which is based in Israel, not just to Israeli leaders, but to Israeli people?
Israel has a lot of wonderful contributions to humanity. I've been there 3 times, and I've seen the science, and I've seen the education, and the poetry, and the innovation, and the contributions to moving human knowledge forward. And it saddens me that contribution to human civilization is being corrupted because of an ugly occupation in the West Bank and Gaza, because of extreme elements that want to see the aspirations for a greater Israel, because of an unwillingness to recognize the humanity and dignity of the Palestinian people. And what I believe is that a new generation, hopefully, of leadership in Israel can emerge that wants to take seriously the dignity and aspirations of the Palestinian people. I'm inspired by how the Palestinians treated Cam Kasky and Jasper Nathaniel on this trip, because as ugly as it was, one of the things that I was so struck by is how warm the Palestinian people were. They welcomed us into our home, and Cam Kasky, a Jewish American, and Jasper Nathaniel, a Jewish American, were greeted with hugs and love and no resentment, but gratitude for them seeking new justice and a fight for justice. And there were many Israeli Jews there who were doing protective presence, and there was a love and gratitude that the Palestinian people had for them. They didn't have anger. They didn't have bitterness. They treated them with the kind of humanity that gives me hope for something going forward. And I just hope deep down the Israeli people, I understand the trauma of October 7th. I understand that it's in a tough neighborhood. I understand how hard the fight was for the foundation of Israel. But we can't go on this way. We need something better. Bibi Netanyahu, Donald Trump, they don't represent the best of humanity. My hope is that people like Cam Kasky and others, they represent where humanity should go. And that's my hope for the region and for the world.
I think that's as good a note as any to wrap up this interview. Again, Congressman Ro Khanna, I'm very grateful to you for coming on the podcast and having some of these tricky conversations about what's happening.
Thank you for having me.
And that wraps things up for this edition of the Haaretz podcast. Thanks to my guest, Congressman Ro Khanna, and to my producer, Dan Brumer, and editor, Adi Shacham. If you are enjoying the podcast, you'd like to keep watching it on YouTube, listening to it on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please don't forget to subscribe to us. And if you're so inclined, leave us a 5-star rating or a comment. And to keep up with all of the latest news on Israel, the Middle East, and the Jewish world, don't forget to subscribe to and follow haaretz.com. I'm Allison Kaplan-Summer, and until next time, shalom from Tel Aviv.